Welcome, everybody. This is the second session of an 8-week course sponsored by the school at the Center for the Study of Digital Life, where I'm president, and 52 Living Ideas, which Shrikant has been running for roughly the same time period. Each of us have been doing this for 5 years, and we have decided to do what Ghostbusters said should never be done. We are crossing the streams here. I really want to thank Shrikant for his enormous talent and help with this, and also the participants who have showed up. I've received many kind comments from some of you, particularly some that I know and who would have been critical if I had dropped the ball, but in general, people were complimenting me on my juggling skills. And we were both particularly impressed with the questions. So what's going to happen, as Shrikant will describe briefly to you, is that this session is going to be split in half. The Q&A is really a crucial part in which I learn many things. CSDL is the website digitallife.center. Shrikant's website also has information about this, so you can go there to find out more. This is a rehearsal of a book that is in preparation. So effectively what you're hearing now is chapter 2 of a book that will be written once things in my life calm down enough for me to concentrate on actually writing this. So welcome to the early stages of what we think is going to be a fascinating and enduring conversation. I'm going to open up, as I will every one of these sessions, with a statement. I'll also close with the same statement, just so that you have some context for what we're trying to do. We no longer live in the modern world. Digital technology has already fundamentally restructured society. So in order to act responsibly in this new world, the causes and consequences of this paradigm shift must be understood. This class is designed to help with that understanding. There are 9 bullet points I have in front of me. So we do a little preparation for this, but this will be pretty much off the cuff nonetheless. But those 9 points will also summarize on the websites, so you have some idea of what the outline looks like. Shrikant, tell us about the format.
All right, folks. This is the most complex and the deepest of these sessions. It is epistemological, theological, metaphysical, and it is historical. It's just amazing. You're about to be hit with a fire hose of ideas. You will need pen and paper. Hold on to your pen and paper and use it wisely to keep track of all the questions that you have. After the presentation, I'm going to ask you for your questions. You can either type them in chat or you can speak them out. Try to keep the questions brief. And I'm going to organize all the questions, get a map of all the questions everybody has, and then go through it from general, the widest questions to more specific. All right, so that's the plan. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Shrikant. I'm going to begin by acknowledging the importance of Eric McLuhan in all of this. Eric, who passed away in 2018, was a very close collaborator with his father, Marshall. In fact, of the 6 children that Marshall and Corinne raised, he was really Marshall's alter ego. And I'm very fortunate to have known him and counted him as a good friend. Eric is the one who surfaced this question of causality, which I must admit, until this was done about 15 years ago, was for me an area that I had never thoroughly considered. So I have been looking at these topics now for a bit more than a decade, but I want you all to try to come with me on a journey here I'm going to read, first of all, the first paragraph of a book that Eric McLuhan published in 2011, Media and Formal Cause. The first paragraph of the foreword says, actually the introduction rather, to the Western mind. Now this is important because what we're going to do today is discuss causality from a Western standpoint, but the purpose of this is to prepare us for the next 6 weeks, in which we will do 2 weeks each on East, West, and digital spheres. And so many of the things that we'll be talking about today will also run through the rest of the course. So this is an important preparation for the rest of what we're doing. To the Western mind, Eric said, the most mysterious feature of formal cause is its paradoxical relationship to effects. The familiar ritual of cause and effect occurs in a sequence, but is quite unable to explain the nature of media. That's to say technology, that's to say psychotechnological environments, that's to say what we're all doing here, and in particular, the rise of digital. You can't explain what these technologies are doing to us without formal cause. He continues, formal cause in many ways synonymous with media, but it's riddled with paradox. By 1964, Marshall McLuhan, his father, identified media themselves as the cause of change in a psyche and society alike. And he discovered that media exert environmental pressures. So this is the underpinning notion that we're working on here. If you'd like to understand better, we'll direct you to some of the work by McLuhan. So we will have, after every one of these sessions, a list of potential readings, and some of that may be useful to you. And now I'm going to read the first couple sentences of an essay that he wrote on formal cause. And this is the preamble. This was first published in 2005 and then picked up in the book I just showed you in 2011. Eric said, there are 4 causes, as you know. There is efficient cause, material cause, and final cause. Yes, he's spelling that C-O-W-S, cause. In addition to formal cause, F-A-R-M'-L, formal cause. Of the 4, formal cause is the fundamental one, and it contains all of the udders. Yes, U-D-D-E-R-S, udders. It is the one that really concerns effects, namely side effects. So, just to be clear here, and I look forward to the questions that apply to this, the title of this session is The Lost Cause. The lost cause is the human soul. That will be the underlying topic we're discussing here. So this is epistemological, it is theological, it is historical. And in fact, I'm going to open with the first 4 bullet points, which take a historical view. So causality turns out to have been a specialty of Aristotle. Aristotle lived in the 4th century BC. In and out of Athens, it may be important to note that he was not Athenian. And the Athenians ultimately didn't like him all that much. So he exited his last opportunity from Athens with the statement that he would not allow the Athenians to make the same mistake twice. This is a reference to their killing of Socrates, and he didn't want to be the next example in that. Aristotle describes in his Physics and in many other places, it ties together his entire metaphysics, 4 causes, the same 4 causes that Eric McLuhan was just talking about. The one we're most familiar with is what we might call the billiard ball sense of causality. And that's cause and effect, as we would in naive common speech describe things. And there's a temporal relationship here. The cause comes first, the effects come afterwards. As Eric describes in some detail in his On Formal Cause essay, for the other three causes, the sequential relationship between cause and effect is turned around. That's why he's calling it paradoxical. And so in those cases, the effects actually in time precede, in a certain sense, the causes. What are the other three causes? The material cause, of course, is the stuff of which the entities involved, and Aristotle here had to invent a term, intellecti. Intellecti is typically not translated because it was a word made up by Aristotle. Our translation choice for Aristotle, if you wish to go and look at Aristotle, would be a fellow by the name of Joe Sachs. Joe Sachs, I think, is now retired from St. John's, Annapolis. He's written extensively about this, and I will point in particular to one of his key books in all of this. And his translation of intellecti was being at work, staying itself. So as you can see, there's a dynamic that is built into all of this, and it does have a certain paradoxical character. Material cause is then supplemented by final cause, which is to say the ultimate end state of any intellecti has a causal impact from the beginning. And then, of course, we have, as Eric would put it, the formal cause, which contains all the others. This is the one that is the most difficult and is the topic of today's discussion. Now, if you would like to drill down on the topic of formal cause, as we're describing it today, then I'm going to recommend to you that you get a translation of Aristotle's peripsyche. That's the Greek term. The proper English translation would be on the soul. So Joe Sachs's On the Soul would be the first place that I would go to get the deep historical basis of all of this. This became, in Latin, de anima. De anima turns out to have been a required text when Aristotle was finally rediscovered in the 13th century. So if you went to the University of Paris in the 1260s, 1270s, de anima would have been at the top of your reading list. That is a sensibility that we have progressively forgotten. So I have two bullet points here entitled The Destruction of Causality. That may be a little bit too overwrought. It certainly is not the case that people immediately forgot about any of this, but oppositions were set up nonetheless. And so as we described last week, and we'll continue to discuss throughout the course, we've been through a series of major psychotechnological environments which have changed, in every case, our sensibilities. Oral became scribal in the axial age, centered roughly around 500 BC. Scribal lasted a long time and had many phases, but ultimately it was replaced by print. And print is when causality began to get in big trouble. So this is not something that happened yesterday. This is something that happened in the 16th and 17th centuries. In particular, I'm going to draw your attention to David Hume. So of all of the Enlightenment figures, the Scotsman, David Hume, is probably the one who is best known today for his deeply skeptical view about causality as a topic overall. So you will find on the internet, the International Encyclopedia of Philosophy, for instance, has an entire section on Hume and causality. Hume is a curious character. He started out writing something called a treatise on human nature, He wrote this at a Jesuit school in France called La Flèche, which turns out to have been the same school to which Descartes attended. So there is a close relationship here in this time period under print conditions in which much of what people had previously thought and understood, which was really quite consistent across a wide variety of thinkers, writers, and others, all the way through to medicine, of course, early science, all of that was based on the four causes that Aristotle had suggested. But by the time we get to Hume, this is all coming into question. So the treatise on human nature was so controversial at the time that he published it that he, number one, did not admit that he wrote it. Number two, he carved it up into a bunch of pieces, hoping that somebody would pay attention. Then he wound up rewriting the thing entirely, the inquiry into understanding. And this then goes back and forth. So you'll find this in the literature about Hume. So Hume is wrestling with all of this, but wrestling with this on the edge of anonymity because the world wasn't really ready for all of this. Science, as it begins in the modern sense at the, let's say, the Royal Society of London, also contributed greatly to this decline of an understanding of causality. In fact, for those of you who've been involved in various displays of new technology, it tends to wind up in demonstrations. Demonstrations tend to be efficient causality. And that's pretty much what the Royal Society wound up doing. So Leibniz, for instance, a member of the Royal Society, a German who actually attempted to set up multiple rivals in particularly in both Germany and in Russia. He understood formal cause. He understood all the causality very well, but his rivals at the Royal Society, the only thing that they wanted him to do was bring in a computer. And so you may remember that calculating engine that was made of brass gears and so forth and could do additions and multiplications. That was Leibniz's response. But his hope was to, in fact, instantiate the full range of Aristotelian causality in both Prussia and in St. Petersburg, Berlin and St. Petersburg, and he failed in doing that. So we're already on a very slippery slope here. David Hume and science need to be accounted for. We're skipping like a stone across the surface of a lake here, touching on these things, but I look forward to any questions you might have. That wasn't the end of the destruction of causality. It turns out much closer to our lifetimes. The surviving billiard ball efficient causality, which if it were properly translated into English, would probably have become not efficient, but kinetic causality, based on the Greek that it came from. That did not survive the 19th century. In fact, what happened in the 19th century is that statistics were inserted for a very particular reason. Statistics, as you all have heard, produce correlations. Correlation is not causality. Very deliberately, particularly in the social sciences, there was a very concerted and successful effort, by and large. And it wasn't just social sciences. Physics also became a statistical measurement. So by the time statistics enters into the picture, causality has left the building. There is a predecessor which headed us in this direction, which I also want to briefly mention here. It turns out, for those of you who have been studying your German philosophers, and the reason why this is probably particularly important is because as we head into the 19th century, the people who are preserving the Greeks, albeit primarily Plato, not Aristotle, are the Germans. And so by the time we get to Wolfgang Goethe, and ultimately, by the time we get to Hegel, with some very interesting characters in the middle, we have transitioned from an understanding of causality to an attempt to actually control by changing the character of human nature. And this took on a very important term, Bildung. So for those of you who have heard about Bildung's Roman, which is a Bildung novel, or may have seen Bildung associated with some of these various characters, there was a deliberate effort starting as early as the early 19th century, which then gets doubled down in the 20th century, to try to form humanity in a way that is different from human nature. In this regard, I'd like to draw your attention to a fascinating book, Forming Humanity, written by a brilliant woman who has an endowed chair at Yale Divinity School, Jennifer Hurt. Again, we will list these titles when we get around to it on their website. But the net of this is, by the time we get through the 19th century, causality has largely been discarded, to the point that today, the number of people who understand formal causality, apart from their professional associations in philosophy, where they have to understand these things, apart from their confessional orientations, has shrunk to almost nothing. This is now in the process of being reversed by digital technology. Specifically, I want to dwell for a couple of moments on the topic of information. So what happened in the 1950s is the idea was promoted that we'd become post-industrial. You probably heard that term. It was particularly associated with the sociologist Daniel Bell. But that didn't really stick. The term that did stick was the information age. What does this word information mean? Obviously, the root is form. In other words, the topic we're discussing today. And yet form has been buried. It's been hidden. It has a prefix and it has a suffix. Information, about which libraries have been written, I would suggest is a deliberate attempt to disguise forms, and not just any old form. The form that is being hidden by the term information is the form of the human being. That form is the human soul. So what's happening here is an attempt to suppress a deeper understanding of the human soul in favor of trying to engineer something different, something that is no longer human. So here I'd like to draw your attention to another title and individual. The individual here is Lawrence K. Frank, a name that no doubt is unknown to the group here. Probably the closest thing this group would know of Larry Frank is his most famous protege, Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson had a daughter. She recently passed away, but Mary Catherine was raised by Larry Frank, not by Margaret Mead. Margaret and Gregory broke up. The child then wound up being raised by Larry. But Larry's importance is much deeper than that. So I encourage you to go take a look at the Lawrence K. Frank Wikipedia entry, which will direct you to his role in the Rockefeller Foundation, and in particular, his role in child development, which is when the human soul is developed. So child development is actually development of the human soul. And I will draw your attention to Larry Frank's engagement with something called cybernetics. So Larry Frank was one of the people who started the Macy conferences. For those of you who have been following the bouncing ball on cybernetics, and in particular following my relationship to all of that, turns out my godfather was Norbert Wiener. My father and Norbert Wiener coined the term cybernetics at a party in 1946 in Cambridge, Mass. But they then lost control of it. And my father was instructed by Norbert Wiener to not follow the field of cybernetics. He became a historian of mathematics. I am carrying out in this presentation and in the book that will follow and the various companies that I've started, I'm following out Norbert Wiener's effort as it was assigned to me by my father. So Larry Frank was the heavy in a situation. And in particular, I will draw your attention to a work published in 1951 by Larry Frank, the title of which is Nature and Human Nature, Man's New Image of Himself. So in this work, Larry Frank lays it all out. It's an obscure work, I understand. Unfortunately, I can't find a scan of it, but we'll try to help anybody who'd like to get access to it. It turns out that this was probably the most crystallized expression of how human nature must be discarded. Human nature, the form of the human, must be discarded if we are going to have progress. We must figure out how to invent new humans. You might consider the Soviet Union's Soviet man, various other attempts to build new man as a part of this broader effort. This is not just going on under the Rockefeller direction. This is heavily engaged in the social sciences in the 20th century. I will also draw your attention here to an essay that I've written. So you will find this on the CSDL website. If you go to the journal heading, you will see that we have 200 plus pages on the inner senses. We'll talk about that somewhat later in this presentation, but it turns out that those inner senses had been discarded because they were no longer useful for the purpose of engineering humans. The title of my essay is Human Engineering and the Inner Senses. Our claim is not only that this movement towards attempting to get rid of human nature, and in the process of that, the human soul has failed. It has failed so severely that we're now in a situation where people are trying to figure out new technologies to replace humans. This is a digital sphere. The last two courses in this, last two classes in this course will be focused on all of that. So, to summarize here, causality, which was codified to begin with by Aristotle, 4th century BC, winds up being incorporated into much of Western philosophy, medicine, and science until it is progressively undermined and ultimately discarded, beginning with the effects of print as a formal cause, then later in a more aggressive fashion under electricity as a formal cause. And now all of that is in the process, we believe, of being reversed as a result of digital technology. In fact, it is our view that we cannot confront the effort to build artificial souls, which is really what the topic of artificial intelligence is all about. So you might imagine that since the word intelligence has no clear meaning, that this broader field of AI is itself kind of a meaningless meme from day one. What is really going on here is an attempt to build artificial humans, and in the process of that, build artificial souls. So this whole process that you may have read about or maybe even been involved in, this process of attempting to upload personalities into computers, this process of attempting to achieve immortality on behalf of humanity, this is a deliberate effort to subvert an understanding of formal cause. And it is our view that unless we can retrieve formal cause, and specifically the form of the human being, the human soul, we will be facing literally an existential threat from artificial humanity. When we began the center 5 years ago, on my first trip to California to run up the flagpole and see if anybody saluted, I extracted some specific quotes from Stephen Hawking. So my guess is that many people who are on this podcast today or listening to this will be familiar with Hawking's. You may not remember that Hawking had a major crusade in the last years of his life against artificial intelligence. So I would show up in Silicon Valley, which is now dominated by people who are completely committed to artificial souls. I went there knowing that I was going into a hornet's nest. And I said, well, what do you think about this Hawking thing? What do you think about his statement that our treatment of this is as if we got a message from outer space? And the message said, we are a vastly superior alien race, and we're heading in your direction. To which our response, this is Hawking's particular language of this, Hawking said, our reaction to this is, no problem, we're going to sleep, but don't worry, we're leaving the lights on. So when you arrive, just come and help yourself. That is, in many ways, the dilemma that Norbert Wiener identified at the very beginning of cybernetics. It is a dilemma that we're now faced. And the only way to reverse this, the only way to undo this, is to recover our understanding of causality, particularly our understanding of formal causality. To do that, we must retrieve an earlier mode of communications, that mode of communications that we call scribal. So the motto you will find on the CSDL website, Digital Retrieves the Medieval, is our expression of the necessity for humanity to retrieve an understanding of what it means to be human, which is to say, to have a human soul, in order to deal with these newly introduced notions. Now, as you will hear when we get to the final classes, the last two on the digital sphere, it is our view that this is not something that has just happened in the last 50 years. That in fact, this effort to transform humanity has a very long history. That history usually gets the name alchemy. There are other terms that might describe it, and we'll get into that in much more detail when we finally get to the digital sphere element of this. So, early childhood development. Remember, this is the topic that Larry Frank specialized in with effectively unlimited resources. So he is the Rockefeller's point man on the formation of the human soul. And this is the man who claims that we have superseded human nature. It turns out that human beings, we may remember part of this from our own lives. Those of us who have children have lived through this in our own children or grandchildren. It turns out that it takes a while for human beings to come to grips with the structure of the world around them. Humans, unlike most other species, have a very long time period. We go through decades before we are fully formed. But a critical period in that formation is what is identified by Jean Piaget as the concrete operational phase, which lines up with what historically we used to call grammar school. So grammar school, which is this phenomenon that sort of centers around the age of 8 to 10, sometimes earlier for some, sometimes later, largely cut off by puberty, because we're now, the biological human is preparing for reproduction. That grammar period is enormously important. And that is the time period in which these psychotechnologies, as the psychology professor Vervenke at Toronto calls them, that is the time period in which we get a grasp on the grammar of the world in which we're living. It is very important to recall that our view here is that that grammar has already fundamentally changed. The grammar that existed as I was growing up remembering the first time that I saw the Howdy Doody show, remembering the fact that as a tyrannical older brother, I would sometimes sit my younger brother in front of the television set to terrify him. Well, my brother Kent's reaction was the correct one. Mine was not. Television is terrifying. And by the time this happened to him, it was already happening to the rest of us. And so the grammar under scribal conditions was fundamentally different than the grammar that was introduced under print conditions as causality is beginning to fall away, which in turn was fundamentally different from the grammar associated with the electrical environment, which obliterated our understanding of causality. And here we are now in the next environment, the digital environment. These themes that I'm talking about, relationship between causality, grammar, and technological environments, are at the root of everything that we've been talking about now for a session and a half. We will return to these subjects over and over again as we go through the rest of all of this. Now, I want to introduce a completely new topic here. This is the topic of tetrads as explained by McLuhan. So as you can well imagine, you've got a Marshall McLuhan here. He's banging his head against the wall. He's trying to get people to pay attention to all of this. Ultimately, his son, out of frustration, has to write it all up. And what he's being told is that, Marshall, you're too roundabout. You write in circles. We need laws. We need something that we can sink our teeth into. And so the effort in the 1970s to rewrite the 1960 Understanding Media then becomes ultimately published after McLuhan's death in 1980, becomes published as Laws of Media. So when people nowadays ask me, where should I start with McLuhan? Where's the right place to begin with all this? I no longer point them to Understanding Media. I point them to the rewrite of Understanding Media. That rewrite occupied Eric and Marshall through much of the 70s. Marshall dies in 1980. It ultimately only gets published in 1988. It's largely written by Eric. So as I've said all along here, Eric McLuhan winds up being a much more straightforward way to tap into what's underlying in all of this. So the tetrad, perhaps not surprisingly, as the name indicates, has 4 quadrants. As Eric described, there are 4 causes. He is correct that what underlies the tetrad is farmal cows. The entire tetrad is about formal cause. And yet there are links to the various other elements of the tetrad. I'm not going to spend much time here today going through in detail what each of them are. I'll just describe them to you quickly. The first cause, or rather quadrant of the tetrad, which then aligns with one of the causes, is called enhance. Enhance turns out to be the this is the new component, what is being brought forward newly into our behavior. The tetrad is a description of 4 simultaneous activities, 4 dynamics that are happening in parallel. By the way, Aristotle never suggested there was a sequential relationship amongst the 4 causes. So going back to Aristotle, the 4 causes were meant to be in parallel, if you will. They were diachronic, they were synchronic, thank you, not diachronic. Diachronic is through time, synchronic is all at once, so to speak. So enhance, what's the new thing coming along? Obsolete, that's obsolescence, that's the second of the 4 quadrants, and that is what is being pushed away, what is being no longer being the ground of our experience. Important to note here that obsolete for McLuhan did not mean disappearing. So it is crucial here to recognize that when something becomes obsolete, it becomes even more important in our lives, superficially. It loses its underlying psychological power on us, but it gets emphasized in the amusing ourselves to death sense of Neil Postman. Thirdly, there is what was originally called reverse, later called flip quadrant. So this is the usual triad that you might associate, for instance, with Karl Marx, or maybe even Hegel, although that would be incorrect. Be that as it may. So thesis would be the obsolesce, antithesis would be the enhance, and synthesis would be the reverse or flip. 4 quadrants. The fourth quadrant is the key. The fourth quadrant is the retrieval. So this takes a linear historic approach and turns it into a circular historic approach. So we're retrieving something from the past. And so without going into more detail here and taking up more time on this heuristic, which was the result of Marshall McLuhan's editors and commentators over the course of a decade or more, Marshall, you need to make this clearer. You have to turn it into a law. The laws of media revolve around these 4 quadrants. And here's the punchline, if you will, of what McLuhan was talking about. We are now exiting from one psychotechnological environment. Let's call it television. We've entered into a new psychological environment. Let's just identify it with computers, digital environment. It turns out that both computers and television are written up in the laws of media. So the laws of media is a description of the effects of artifacts on us. So since television is now obsolete, which we could go in some length about how that has actually developed and how the craziness of what you see on television corresponds to the severe decline in viewership. As you probably know, there are vast swaths of the population now that don't watch television anymore. This is particularly true probably of 20 and 30-year-olds, but I've had conversation with 60, 70-year-olds who they've just given it up. No longer of any interest. The flip quadrant for television, as published in 1988, that's, say, the world that we're now leaving, that is written up with specifically identified as the inner trip. So since television is an illusion machine, there is no picture there. If you take a camera, put it in a shutter speed of 1/200th of a second, or even 1/100th of a second, point it at a television set, you'll get no image, because there is no image there. It's constantly being refreshed. Our brains are being fooled. It's a total illusion process based around something called the flicker frequency. It turns out that the inner trip is what we're leaving behind. So that's what's heading off into the past. If you then, in laws of media, turn to the question of computers, you'll find something fascinating. The retrieval quadrant, which is to say, what we're bringing from the past back into our lives now, has a very simple description: perfect memory. This shift from illusory inner trip to perfect memory, total and exact, as it is published in the 1988 book, is about as psychologically wrenching as possible. This is the reason why, we would suggest, the world appears to be in chaos. This is the reason why institutions all around us political, economic, religious, artistic institutions are all now failing. They were attuned to the earlier environment. They catered to the inner trip. Virtual reality is a fine example of how Hollywood wanted to drive this. That is not going to happen. Certainly not on the scale that they had hoped. Instead, what is happening is we're shifting into a memory-based environment. So, in wrapping things up here, and we'll discuss all of these foundational items as we go through, again, the 6 sessions which remain, 2 on East. You really don't want to miss next week. Next week is going to be fantastic. The first session on China, in terms of the East, is going to be mind-blowing. We've lined up a guest speaker who is going to tell us about what we believe the Chinese have discovered in terms of energy, which has massive implications, economic and beyond. John Alton will be joining us. Don't miss that. So we're going to be talking about all of these underlying fundamentals in relationship to the 3 spheres, East, West, and digital. And they all are treating these things somewhat differently. I'm just going to close again by repeating what I said before. We no longer live in the modern age. Digital technology has already fundamentally restructured everything in our life. It may not be so easy to grasp logically, consciously, argumentatively, but subconsciously, we all know this. It is really easy to point to the world around you and recognize how the subconscious today is radically different from what it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. So, in order for us to act responsibly in this new world, which does not follow the same old rules, we must understand the causes. It's the purpose of today's presentation, abbreviated as it was, and the consequences of this paradigm shift. How can you be responsible for anything if you don't understand the world in which you are living and the effects of these technologies? And so here you are in the second session of a course designed to help with that understanding. I thank you all very much for your attention. And now I think Shrikant's going to shift us over to Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Folks, it's time for Q&A. Keep your questions brief. Go ahead and either you can type in your question in the chat or you can speak it out. In order to speak out the question, go ahead and type exclamation mark in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom. All right. Try to, no statements, just brief questions, please. I'm going to start with a question so it'll give you some time to line up for questions. Mark, how do the 4 quadrants of McLuhan's tetrad map to the 4 causes?
Well, 4 causes, remembering here, are efficient, material, final, and formal. I'll start with the most important, formal cows. That one most closely associates with the retrieval quadrant. So as we said before, formal cows contain all the others. So what's going on here is that this retrieval quadrant that was added, so as you will see when you read the beginning of Laws of Media, they say we discovered the first 3 very quickly, but it took us a while to get to that 4th cause and or 4th quadrant retrieval. So retrieval corresponds, not identical to, these are somewhat different fields we're dealing with, but corresponds to a formal cause. The flip or reversal corresponds to the final cause. So the final expression of television, for instance, is to drive people into a internalized fantasy state. So virtual reality in particular, as it's been promoted by Hollywood, and lots of money has been spent there and in technology companies, that's the final cause. So we only have two more left. We've got efficient cause and material cause. And we've got, we have the obsolesce and we have the enhance. I would suggest that enhance probably deserves to be associated with efficient or kinetic causality. It's that dynamic that is driving us. And I would suggest that obsolesce corresponds to material cause, where again, these correspondences are loose. I discussed this at some length with Eric McLuhan. He was curious about these associations. He insisted correctly that the entire heuristic is a formal causal mechanism, but it is not coincidental, he agreed. We wound up with 4 causes and 4 quadrants.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Now, there are lots of questions which are, so I'm right now I'm trying to put together all the questions. There are lots of questions which are clarificatory. Let's see here. We start with Simone asks about what exactly formal cause is. So that's one. Second is Chris asked about information, elaborating on the concept of information and how it is subversive. Let's see, who else do we have? Folks, go ahead and type your questions in. Can you speak more about potential dangers of AI? But that I'm going to keep towards the end because we're going to have 2 full sessions on that. Connor Crawley asked, I was wondering if the tetrad mapping to Ken Wilber's integral way make up, grow up, clean up, show up, iterate and transcend. Okay, so that is, we'll keep that on tetrads. That also I'll put in clarificatory questions. Laura, did you have a clarificatory question? Just very brief question, go ahead. You're on mute. Just go ahead and state a brief question, please.
Going through all these different stages is going to be different for everybody. So how is this all going to get to the right point at the right time? Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Okay. So the question is, the question I'm going to put is, given that these causes operate all together, how do people actually traverse these causes? So I'll put that along with the formal causes. Let's see, is there anybody else? No, folks, you can keep on adding questions and I will keep on organizing them. Lester Buck asks, Julia Pearl and others have done a lot of work on causality, not correlation. Have we really abandoned causality? So what about the work of Julia Pearl? Okay. All right. We'll start with these questions and folks, you can keep on adding questions. I will keep on organizing them as we go along. So let us start with the formal cause, the question on formal cause, and then follow up with the interrelated to the concept of information. Please go ahead, Mark.
Sure. Many people have attempted and failed, in my judgment, to answer the question, what is formal cause? It winds up being difficult for modern Western people, as Eric begins his introduction, to grasp what's going on here. Let me give you an example. Probably one of the more prominent in mid-20th century terms, Aristotelians, in the sense of having popularized the notion, would be Mortimer Adler. Some of you may know Mortimer Adler and his relationship to great books, for instance. Mortimer Adler published a book, Aristotle, for everyone. You might think of it as Aristotle for dummies. not a term that was used when he wrote that, but that's effectively what he did. So when he gets to formal cause, he does the following. He fudges. He deflects. He suggests that the formal cause of a chair is its design. And in all of this, what he has, of course, hidden is the question of who designed that. So he has selected a dead object, which is, first of all, sending us in the wrong direction. And then he has effectively described this as if there is an architect. Now, I never got to meet Mortimer Adler. I've met many people who knew him. I've asked this question and never gotten a good answer. So I don't know how to ultimately parse this. But if Mortimer Adler were being honest about it, and I'm not for a moment suggesting that he was either dishonest or not knowing this, but his audience would not have allowed him to say what I'm about to say. The only form that really is important is the human soul. Just start thinking about all of the aspects of the soul that you've encountered in your life. We can start with soul music, for instance. We can start with the fact that Kanye West is going to run for president in 2024. He's no longer a rap singer. He's now a soul singer. We're going to have the soul reintroduced back into politics, thanks to Kanye and probably others. But just think of all the other ways in which soul, the soul of this, the soul of that, these are essential characteristics. Just think of soul sucking and various other phrases that people know about terrible things that happen to you. And then step back and say, what would a human without a soul look like? We have zombies. We have flesh bots. We have various ways that people are acting as if they did not have a soul. So my answer to your question of what is formal cause is, what is the form of a human being and what does it cause us to do? Psyche is the Greek word. Anima, from which we get animation and so forth, is the Latin word. Soul is the English word. Etymologies are important here. Soul has a somewhat complicated background, but I think we understand, at least generally, what we're talking about. And yes, these are topics that can be explored in much greater detail with far more nuance. But what I'm trying to do in this particular class is to compel you to move away from the architect, move away from the design, move away from any of those sort of associations, not the form of a dead object, but the form of a living one. And so the formal cause of a human being is its soul. That is what I mean by formal cause. And I know I'm being potentially controversial here. I don't know what the religious affiliations are or even interests of this crowd. I will note for you that the person who identified this first and drove it forward was a pagan from Athens, Greece. This is not a Christian notion. And in fact, the notion of a soul is universal, as best I can tell, across all of human civilizations. We will talk about how the soul intersects with the various spheres and the rest of this, but hopefully that's helpful in terms of what is formal cause. The answer to the question was formal cause. Formal cause is the human soul. That's the best way to think about this.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Next question comes from Chris. Can you go deeper into the subversive meaning of the term information?
Yes. As I said before, and probably most importantly, Information, which, by the way, does not have a straightforward definition. There are some people, of course, who link it back to Shannon's theories. There are various people who would link it to mathematical formulas and neg entropy. There have been a whole series of explanations, but I will guarantee you that if you go out and try to find a stable and agreed upon definition of what is information, you won't find it. Information is subversive because it buries the meaning of form. And very importantly, it opens up the possibility that form need not be associated with the soul. In fact, information is dead. There's nothing alive about any of those definitions, whether it be information theoretic, whether it wind up being negentropic. So the subversive character, Chris, of information as a term is that it takes us away from our understanding of what it means to be human. Now, who cares? Does that matter? We all know who we are. We go to church, we don't go to church. We believe things, we don't believe things. Why would information subvert that process? And my suggestion is that it points towards this artificial humanity trying to get us to believe that there are underlying principles here that would allow us to build artificial humanity. At this particular point, now remembering we've been across a wide range of history here. In Aristotle's days, in Aquinas's days, in Goethe's days, in Nietzsche's days, all the way up through Larry Frank's days and so forth. We did not have the technology to try to invent something based on information which is soulless. However, that is our situation today. We cannot avoid the situation. I was recently on a presentation to a group of Russian futurists, and the question that came back, the pressing question at the end of all of this was, wait a minute, I thought climate change was the problem we're all supposed to be worried about. Isn't that the biggest risk? No, it's not. Climate change, as it turns out, is a problem that has been studied, analyzed, actions have been taken, policies have been written, an enormous amount of work has been done over the past 50, 60, 70 years. Take us back to the origins of Earth Day, if you want to. Or if you care to, you can go back to Silent Spring. We've been working on that problem. And in the process, we have been, I suggested to the Russians, we have been ignoring the even more important problem, which is getting rid of humans, replacing humans with something more perfect. So the subversive character here, Chris, of information is it leads us to believe that we can perfect ourselves. If we just have the right information in the right place at the right time, then we have overcome everything that is imperfect about us. And I believe that it will be that intersection between the urge to perfect ourselves and the recognition of an inherent imperfection that is built into the situation, therefore challenging our souls, that winds up being the largest effect of this information notion.
Thank you, Mark. So we're going to take a couple of questions on tetrad, then there is a bunch of questions on human soul, and there is an interesting question about television. So that's what is coming up next, folks. Okay. On tetrads, Laura asks that if all of these four effects are simultaneous, will not different people take different paths and end up in different places while they are working on these causes or working on these quadrants?
Right. Well, Laura, thank you. The first thing to note here is that the impact of these causes and quadrants is subconscious. Our relationship to our own subconscious not only varies individual to individual, but it varies from location to location, culture to culture, and certainly generationally. So the answer to your question is yes. There are many paths through this matrix that I've described. What we have been finding, and I'm not here pretending that we have done a global survey on this, probably would be a useless exercise in any event. So therefore, all we will wind up with likely will be more anecdotal. But our experience anecdotally is that of all of those elements, personal experiences, relationship to our subconscious, and so forth, cultural differences, that the most important indicator appears to be generational. So it would appear to us, and we would link this back to the topic of when were you born and when did you go to grammar school, so to speak. When is it that you figured out the structure of the world? That looks to us like the biggest differentiator. So the differences between, I'm 73. I have 2 children. They are 39 and 34. We have many collaborators working with us in their 20s and 30s. One of the exercises, projects that the center is launching is called Trivium University, specifically a graduate school, meaning that the audience for that will be smart 20-somethings. Our best guess, could be wrong, is that the path through this matrix that will likely be most important for all of our futures will be how do those smart 20-somethings deal with all of this? And we're finding interesting parallels in different parts of the world, across different cultures. It's possible, of course, that we are just confirming our own biases in these anecdotal approaches to this. My hope is that as we move forward with Exogenous Inc., EXO, as we move forward with Trivium University, that over the course of the next few years, we learn a great deal more about this. So your question is an important one. It's absolutely correct. There is no uniformity. There's all kinds of particularity going on here. We have a lot to learn, a lot of work to do.
Wonderful. Let me ask a follow-up question on that. You talked about grammar being different depending on the psychotechnological environment used. Could you elaborate on that? How is the grammar different in, let's say, scribal, print, electric, and now digital?
We tend to think of grammar as being sentence structuring or something, diagramming sentences. And very often in linguistics, for instance, I was just reading the other day in some detail about Japanese grammar. So the fact that the last word in the sentence tends to be a verb, and the fact that Turkish and Japanese are described by linguistics as having outlying, unlike Chinese, English, Semitic languages, different grammar, that's not exactly what we're talking about here. What we're talking about instead is the sense that an 8 to 10-year-old, roughly corresponding to what we used to call grammar school, recognizes as their necessary skills to deal with the structure of the world in which they're growing up. If they wish to be a part, or for that matter, if they wish to not be a part, if they wish to conform, here we have that root form once again. If they wish to inform, there are many fascinating words that use form in it. But however we wind up, based on the particularities of our lives, however we wind up, we are going to have to come to grips with the structure of the world around us. That is the grammar I'm talking about. So answering Shrikant's follow-on question here. Under scribal conditions in which people were literate for the first time, so scribal is what follows the previous oral environment, the effects of literacy are incredible, particularly upon human memory. So here I will draw your attention to the work of Merlin Donald, somebody who Shrikant has actually done multiple interviews with, and somebody that we work with, but Shrikant had found him before we actually got together. He talks about this transition to external storage. So if the structure of the world is one in which knowledge is no longer inside, but outside, that is a grammar that is radically and fundamentally different from a pre-literate oral society. Print, which follows scribal, turns that external memory into something that is mechanical. It turns it into something which is linear. It turns it into something which has a perspective. So all of a sudden, point of view becomes enormously important in the structure of the world. So you might have some Renaissance paintings in mind, all those paintings with all the straight lines that converge on a point. That would have made no sense whatsoever to the grammar of a scribal world. No sense whatsoever. So the notion of progress, linear progress, is introduced by the printing press. But in addition to that, the notion that a human being is a clock, a clockwork, a mechanical item, this becomes the grammar under print conditions. This gives us Descartes. Cogito, ergo sum, is a clockwork divorced from the reality of the human soul. As we get to electric, which comes in the late 19th century and defeats print, now we wind up with according to McLuhan, which I think is correct, we wind up with a shift in the grammar of the world as something being understood visually to something being understood orally with our ears. The primary characteristics of those two senses are radically different. In particular, art winds up being probably the best way. So I was just talking about perspective as a print derived. So Debbie and I were just actually at the Met, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, yesterday. So when you're in New York, I would recommend that you take a trip around the Metropolitan Museum and try to identify which of these environments produced which of these items. In particular, at the center of what I think is called the medieval art section, you now have four figures, one of which is a bust of Constantine. Absolutely remarkable. So this was done around 325 AD. Next to that is a South American Toltec structure. And the grammar of those two, and I forget, there are four, I forget what the other two are, but just in that one location, as brought together by the museum, you will see four radically different grammars. The grammar of digital, the grammar in which we are now living, is a grammar that involves children growing up recognizing that everything that humanity has ever known is in their pocket. The notion that we are all now carrying around the Library of Alexandria and so much more as a grammatical statement about the structure of the world means in particular that for the first time, anybody can educate themselves. They do not need to go to Harvard. They do not need to incur crushing debt. They can, in fact, and many have, substantially self-educated themselves because of the grammar of digital and memory. So that's a brief explanation of the differences. But art would be the best way to see this. McLuhan was very big on this. So the whole notion of modern art, I'm remembering when I went with my daughter to the the Museum of Modern Art, when she was about 13, she became an artist. So she wound up selecting a school where she could actually learn figurative art, which is not so easy to do. Commercial art is what most people were teaching. I remember at the age of 13, having her presenting Jackson Pollock to her. And we could have done the same thing, with surrealism or any number of other art movements of the 20th century. And her reaction was, that's scribble. I can do that. And she could do that, but she didn't want to do that. So Pollock is, of course, much more interesting than scribble and the abstract expressionists, their relationship to the CIA and Cold War. There's all kinds of ways you can take that. But the fact of the matter is, as I have stated in the beginning and the end, we no longer live in the world as represented by the Museum of Modern Art.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. That was great. Next, I'm going to take a question from Doc Searles. He asks, the amount of time people spend watching broadcast television has gone way down, but the slack has been picked up by subscription streaming. Hollywood itself has largely moved from theaters to home screens, and the time all of us spend staring at glowing rectangles is such as right now is also way up. I'm sure all these developments are effects of digital's formal cow, but I would like you to enlarge on that. And where does soul fit in all of this?
You got to count on Doc, who's an old friend, to bring a summary of all this together, which I will quickly try to answer. Thank you, Doc. The answer, of course, as you know, is we're in transition. The further answer, as you know, is that we don't really have a very good understanding of what people actually do when they spend their time. And so as a result of that, I believe we're thrown back into a kind of an anecdotal set of experiences. People do not like what we're doing now if there's an option. So the first and most important thing to say here, I think, is that while we may be streaming, and we may be streaming in large quantities, my guess is that the people who are doing that, therefore tilting the statistics, wind up being a sort of a retrograde component of the civilization. My anecdotal experience has been that human beings would much rather spend time with other human beings than they would be staring at screens. My anecdotal experience is that those kinds of person-to-person engagements have been dramatically emphasized as desirable as a result of COVID. So I think what's happening here is that the human qualities that we have, which is to say human souls, would really rather spend time with other human souls. Now, how do you do that on a mass basis? So we're talking about mass media by and large here. We're talking about television. The answer, of course, is you can. And yes, you can go to a Trump rally in Iowa. You can go to a football game. You can go to a NASCAR race. To some extent, those things are mass behavior, but having recently been to a baseball game, it's not really a mass behavior at all. It winds up being you and the people who are sitting in the seats around you. It winds up being on a much smaller scale. So Another important aspect of all of this that I haven't discussed here is the question of scale. The technology industry that Doc and I both come from has been championing the notion of high scale for a long time now. Facebook, I guess, is the obvious example. We are now transitioning, I'm quite confident, to a different kind of scale. And so teasing out the difference between mass scale and human scale will probably be the single most important way that we anecdotally discover the recovery of the human soul. So we're in transition. We don't really know all of what's going on. Some people have done a fantastic job, particularly on the question of what is trusted and what is considered to be dangerous and what is considered to be scary in all of this. There are some folks on the call here who are real experts in the media reactions, and I would just summarize from what I understand their work is that we are already radically shifting away from previous behavior patterns into behavior patterns that are not yet fully formed, but patterns that I suspect are going to wind up pushing mass aside, pushing human scale to the front, raising the importance of trust, raising the importance of actually having virtue in your life. And all of this will play out over the course of the next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you, Mark. Now, there are many questions on the soul. So people are very, very interested in understanding this concept. I'm going to start with just one of them and then ask you to elaborate. Govert asked, isn't the soul in Aristotle embedded in the body? Let me enlarge that question, because I think that's something that people are having difficulty kind of grasping. So, and you've done quite a bit of work on Aquinas and how the concept of soul works, the cogitative sense. So could you just talk a little bit about how you see the soul, maybe with reference to Aquinas?
Sure. For those of you who have put your toe in the water of Aristotle, you'll recognize that his metaphysics is typically described as hylomorphic. Hylo being, in this case, a description from the Greek word for wood, in other words, matter. And the morphic part of that description is form. One of the words that is used in Greek for what we're now describing is morphe. And so the combination of form and matter is the basic metaphysics we're dealing with here. But let's remember, the Greeks preceded, in the West, the Christian understanding of the soul, and in particular, the notion of immortality. The question of immortality of the soul is positively asserted by both Aristotle and his teacher, Plato. They had different ideas about what that would mean, whether it was individual, whether it was collective, but I don't think it's controversial in terms of either of their metaphysics that the soul has an immaterial quality to it. So matter plus form, the soul, is not a material quality, it is an immaterial quality. And as something that is immaterial, it can, in fact, survive death. That was a very common view. And I'll just note here for you that the most significant religious ritual, arguably, in Athenian history were the Eleusinian Mysteries. Eleusinian Mysteries have been studied in great detail more recently, so the mystery aspect of this might have fallen away. The general view now is that the experience at Eleusis was a natural LSD experience. Why is that important? It turns out that amongst all of the various what used to be called hallucinogens, psychedelics, and now are called entheogens, it turns out the most important effect of this on the Athenians was to give them a sense of immortality. And every Athenian who had not been convicted of murder was expected to undergo this experience. So the notion that the soul is bound and disappears along with us in death is not the way the Athenians thought about this. Now, to be sure, the Athenians are not the rest of the Greeks, but I think you would find the same thing to be the case in the Rig Veda, for instance. I think you would find the same thing to be the case in Chinese metaphysics. And so I believe universally across human civilizations, the topic of the first class, you will find very significant indications pointing towards the immortality or transmigration or various ways it is described in all of these cultures. I hope that helps. I'm not sure that was the full question you were asking them.
That's good. Now let's see. We are at about 4:30. So how about just doing a little bit of a preview first about what is coming up on China?
Sure. As you will not be surprised, Western physics did not arrive in China until recently. You might suspect that the Chinese had developed a physics before Western physics arrived. That physics describes, if you want, cosmic energy under the heading of qi, now typically transliterated as a QI. The practical application of an understanding of traditional Japanese understanding of energy is expressed in a variety of ways. One way that it's expressed is in the martial arts and related methodologies known as Qigong. We will be very fortunate next week to have in the middle of the sandwich, so I will be the first part and the end part of this, but current Chinese society is deeply committed. This is not superficial. This is not something that is simply trying to keep the CPC in power. This is a retrieval of classical Chinese culture to the extent that the current leadership up through the Standing Committee of the Politburo are being taught the I Ching. And so what you will hear next week will be a discussion of how qi has turned into a new understanding of physics with energy production, with energy weapons, with communications, with human development, all bundled in with this. And so we're going to have a condensed version of this from a Qigong master who is also a fellow at the center, John Alton.
Wonderful. So let's end with the question, which is also talking about the last two sessions. Can you speak about the potential danger of AI to human soul?
Sure. We do not believe that what is known in the field as artificial general intelligence, AGI, can be accomplished with the current techniques. So, whether it's machine learning, whether it is the next step as Judea Pearl described, and so there was a question here about Pearl. Pearl's most recent book, The Book of Why, does indeed deal with this topic of causality. And he has some proposals for how to address this. They won't work. Deep learning, way beyond machine learning, won't work. teaching a robot how to perform the I Ching is getting closer, and that is being done in China. Teaching robots, or algorithms rather, how to accomplish common sense won't work. So the dangers of AI are not that what Ray Kurzweil or others would suggest, that we will wind up in a singularity in which the computing power of silicon will surpass the computing power of humans. That's not the danger. In fact, human beings are not computers. So the danger of AI today should be encapsulated under the view that these scary AGI, who needs humans, we're going to turn them into our pets, that whole science fiction world, that is not the danger we're talking about. The actual danger we're talking about is the fact that there are a significant number of human beings, many of whom testify in front of Congress, many of whom have vast fortunes, many of whom have already disturbed our lives, have committed themselves to replacing humans as soon as possible. And in this, I will just simply highlight all of the interesting discussion about Shatner going into space and the Star Trek implications of this. If we were to think through the underlying subconscious dimension of this, we are preparing ourselves for environments in which humans cannot survive. That's not what's going on with these space launches for space stations. Those are all very carefully controlled environments. But we are heading into a situation in which the answer to the question, can the machines somehow get the upper hand? This is a question that was put to Norbert Wiener, my godfather, in 1963 by a publication some here may even remember, U.S. News and World Report. Dr. Wiener, can the machines someday get the upper hand on the humans? His answer was straightforward. Yes, that is a possibility, but only if the human beings drop the ball. If the human beings do not step up, if they do not realize what it means to be human, the human beings don't step up and realize that the machines, the gadgets, as he described it, are useful for some things, but not useful for the really interesting things, then we're in very serious trouble. So the danger of AI today is that we will not remember the human soul. We will not remember what it means to be human, that we will instead focus on information and other related ways that we avoid the important topics. It is very much our hope at the Center for the Study of Digital Life. The reason why we're putting on these classes is that the understanding of what it means to be human becomes contagious. And I believe there are many indications that's already underway, but we do not know the outcome of all of this. We all have a lot of work to do.
Thank you, Mark. Would you like to make any closing statements?
Let me reread again the reason why we're doing this. We no longer live in the modern world. You can hang on to whatever parts of it you want. I'm not suggesting that you all of a sudden start wearing funny clothes and speaking in strange languages. We're in transition, but we don't live there anymore. In fact, we haven't lived there for 20 or so years. This technology, digital, at a fundamental subconscious level, has already transformed us. We're very much focused on the question of responsibility. This is the reason why Exogenous Inc. Has been formed to deal with people in positions of responsibility, C-suite people, leaders in various fields. And the responsibility is passing on to a new generation, therefore trivium mu. So if you wish to be responsible in this new environment, you've got to understand the causes. So you've got to retrieve formal causality, and you have to understand the consequences of your own actions. This is not going to be easy, but it is the reason why I've designed this course. And again, I want to thank you all for spending hour and a half plus with me, and I hope you come back for the rest of the courses. We will do 2 on the East, starting with John Alton on China. Then we'll follow up the week after that with Japan and India. Then we'll do 2 on the West and how the West might, in fact, retrieve its virtues. And then we'll do 2 to wrap this all up on the digital sphere and the current state of alchemy in the world. Thank you again.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. And thank you, everybody, for great questions. See you next. See you coming Sunday at 3 p.m. Bye, everybody.